But let me just tell you about our group before we get started. We're known for we're the North Jersey Civil War Roundtable. We're known for our scholarly and political. I can't write my handwriting and approach to our programs. We've had two Pulitzer Prize winners, James McPherson, Eric Foner, and we would have had a third, Edward Larson, who would have spoken before a group, but COVID had stopped that. We've had some of the Heidi, you're included in here, but it comes without saying. but the programs we had: James Bud Robertson, Ed Bars, Michael Burlingame, who was the top Lincoln scholar, and if you don't have his dual biography, that's really the classic that's out right now. I mentioned Craig Somens, and you pretty much mentioned the name of pretty famous people. We've had them as our speakers over the year. Now, here's our group. We are the only group, Civil War Roundtable, to have an annual Civil War legal program. It's presented by attorneys. It was started by Judge Harper, who's on now. And it's now in the 20th year of this. And we bring in only attorneys or judges to participate in this lecture. If you're an attorney and you want to volunteer for next year, not this year, if you want to volunteer for next year, we'd love to have you join us here. It takes a lot of work, though. This is not a run-of-the-mill talk. You're doing research and you're putting this program together. As a matter of fact, 2 years ago, our program with Jay Maloney, hopefully he's on now, his program was selected by CLE, that's Continuing Legal Education, and the attorneys took the course, not that night, it was made another night, and they paid $200 for that course on that thing. So that's the caliber of the class we have here. So it's not just that three guys getting up and talking. It's a lot of work. And Jay Maloney is going to be doing next year, this year rather, and he'll be doing, I can't think of the topic, but it's on General Grant, and it's also the eradication of the KK Clay and the other cases that happened here. But that's next month. Next program's next month. Now, I'm just trying to think. We also have, as part of our group, a members-only book group. For guys, even a Civil War Roundtable, this is something you may want to consider offering to your group. We don't do the book of the month. We do the book and we exhaust the book as we go through chapter by chapter. So some books have taken 5 months, some books have taken 6 months, even more. And John Harper prepares a set of discussion questions, or has been preparing a set of discussion questions, which really involve going into this book and discussing it at length. This is something you may want to offer to your members. It's not a book of the month, and obviously a lot of people don't read, but a select group will join in the conversation and give you something else to do. Again, but then again, that's only open to our members, and you might want to consider. So some of these guys want to do this. As a matter of fact, what happens in 1861 by Adam Goodhart, he goes into length about Lincoln's July 4th speech, and it became such intense that I turned to Tom Hilder, who was previously had presented on our legal program, that we are going to do a dual program. I'll ask him questions, and he'll discuss Lincoln's second July 4th speech. The speech really, you don't read about it, but again, a homework assignment, I'll tell you something. You got to read this through here. I'm fudging through my pages here. The last chapter, let's see. And that's the program I mentioned. I'll give you a head start on that. We haven't picked a date for that, but we will be. But since Zoom, our meetings are now solely on Zoom. We no longer have live meetings. What happened with COVID, the crowd wasn't coming back. And the benefit of it is we now have members from 11 states, including Wyoming, obviously California, and Barry Crompton from Australia. And I did a count a few weeks ago. We had 18 states come on to the lectures. And then Fernando's coming on. He's coming on from Venezuela. So this is something that never happened. There was too far for Barry to drive to our meeting. So I'm glad we're able to do this. And we can also get a guy like somebody like roundtables, like Mike Hoover's coming on, Ken Caddis from Florida. on a different level, we are members of American Battlefield Trust, where it's a color bearer level, and we make other contributions. We make other contributions during the year, and I'm very proud of that. The fact that we're the color bearer level. As a matter of fact, one of our former members, and if you see hallowed ground, one of our former members was the late Norman B. Tomlinson Jr. And Norman, he's passed away 10 years ago, but his name is still listed on the $3 million line. So I'm pretty, he was a great individual through that. We're on YouTube. You heard Abigail mention that. And if you'd like to become a member, we're not a fundraising organization. We are a 501c3. But we're not fundraising. But if you do want to join and help support our programs, our dues are $39. Why $39? That's probably the only thing you're going to remember about what I'm saying tonight. $39 you remember paying. $40 you forget. And that's basically our organization. Now, let me introduce. I don't know how you do. You turn me off and you put on Dr. Weber. Abigail.
Do you want her to start sharing her screen now, or do you want to introduce her first?
Yeah, well, let me introduce her and then take me off.
And then she will share her screen. Okay.
Right. Okay. I'm gonna. Heidi, I'm gonna keep this short. Nobody ever remembers everything you publish and you go through when you go to the other lectures, and the guy goes on for 5 minutes, and the only thing you don't have repeating is like maybe the guy was bar mitzvah, they gave a speech then. That's the only thing. But what I love is you're a professor of history and military history at SUNY, that's State University of New York in Orange. She's received the Excellence Award from the school, and also for the New York Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. And the one thing I've got to remember, and I think this is something, she's on the selection to select students for the U.S. Military Academy, and she's doing that on behalf of Senator Cory Booker. And then you're on the military force. I'm sorry, you'll correct me when you get on about the military force that you're on. Those are the things, the important things that you remember about Dr. Weber, and those are the things I think you will have to remember for that. Okay. So I didn't list all the publications you did, but it comes with the territory. For God's sakes, I got a doctorate, so. Thank you. And I really want to thank you. And by the way, we're just discussing it. For those of you who are coming on a little bit later, one of the members, Bill Kramer, raised it. He said, we're going to do a program on the generals. And they started to go into detail. And for those of you who know me, I work without embarrassment. So I turned to Dr. Weber and I said, that's your program next year. And that's going to be the program next year. But that's how I work. And I don't apologize for that.
Hey, good evening. I am Dr. Heidi Amelia-Anne Weber, and as Rich introduced me, I'm a professor of military history at SUNY. What he was mentioning, I'm also, in addition to doing the military academy screener, where we interview the students and make our choices and forward it on to the senators. I'm a part of West Point's field force, which is to help guide students in their junior and senior year, and so that they can get everything done in their applications. And I've been doing that for a few years, and that's a really rewarding experience as well. So tonight I'm going to talk about the campaign at Vicksburg, the Siege of Vicksburg. Before we begin, I'm going to introduce my dog and cat. Invariably, Missy, who, by the way, was rescued from Holly Springs, Mississippi, and then my cat, Hawkeye, who somebody dumped and just moved in. They, of course, right now, you might hear them bark or meow. I try to keep them entertained, but just so you are aware that they are in the room. So when we think of July 4th, Americans tend to reflect upon independence, the celebrations that accompany the holiday, the commemoration of 4th of July is symbolic of the endurance of the American nation. There was, however, an 81-year hiatus in Vicksburg, Mississippi, from celebrating July 4th. It was not until the 4th of July in 1945 that, with the end of the World War II, that Vicksburg decided that they would celebrate this holiday again. This was because in Vicksburg's history, July 4th, 1863, is a very dark day for the people who lived in Vicksburg. So they get rid of the snub and they officially go back. The significance of the siege and capture of Vicksburg is really, it's often overlooked in the wake of the fact that the Battle of Gettysburg happens, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. This is, the big invasion. And the reality is, just so you are aware, Gettysburg National Military Park is the most visited Civil War site in the National Park Service. They get, countless numbers, whereas Vicksburg gets 500,000 visitors a year. It barely even ranks of people visiting. And so that just reasserts that version. Vicksburg, Mississippi is strategically positioned between the high bluffs at the hairpin turn of the Mississippi River. The river itself would prove to be the centerpiece of the campaign. If the Union could successfully take Vicksburg, they would control the Mississippi and divide from Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. They could detach and separate the Confederacy into two. This was part of the original Anaconda Plan. This is what Winfield Scott had been speaking of, but we Americans have attention spans of fleas. We want something instant, we want it done quickly, and people felt that this was just going to take too long. As the reality of a long war set into 1861, we're going to start to see elements of the Anaconda Plan come into play. From the onset of the war, the control of the Mississippi River is essential. We can see, the Mississippi, its tributaries, it's vital to the conduct of operations. Rivers are often perceived as obstacles. Okay, so it's normally thought that it would be difficult to maneuver your forces, maneuver cannon, maneuver your troops across the river. It comes with great challenge. The Mississippi is essential for the movement of supplies through the Confederacy. It is able, through the Mississippi, they're able to get supplies to the Trans-Mississippi region, and as well, those to the east. The Mississippi is one of the most challenging, and the region of Vicksburg is going to be one of great difficulty. In addition to the river, there are bayous, there are swamps, which makes access to Vicksburg almost impossible. It's virtually impossible. There are very high bluffs, and this is going to be from where the Confederacy will be able to position their artillery to control the river below. Having successfully taken Shiloh, Tennessee, the opportunity presented itself for the Union forces to penetrate into the heartland of Mississippi. At hand will be Major General Ulysses Grant, coming off his great victory at Shiloh, where he is starting to be ridiculed for the fact of all of the casualties, and once again, the commentary about him being drunk at the battle comes forward. Grant had the intellectual bandwidth to identify opportunities that were not evident to others. He combines this with an inclination to accept risks that most military professionals did, ones that they found, other military professionals found unacceptable. And he demonstrates this ability at the strategic as well as tactical level of warfare. By identifying the risk at Shiloh, for example, he addressed the hazards and tolerated the residual risks to achieve the strategic objective, thus ensuring victory. It is going to be time again for him to use these abilities at Vicksburg. Vicksburg, by the way, is the second largest city in the Confederacy. Number one is going to be Richmond. It is a trading city. It is a major center. It has foundries that were capable of producing artillery, ammunition. And at this point in the war, when we are getting into 1862 and then into 1863, it is absolutely vital to the Confederacy for the East-West transfer point of agricultural commodities from Louisiana, weapons brought through the Union blockade via Texas. The capture of Vicksburg became a vital goal. To Confederate President Jefferson Davis, Vicksburg was, quote, the nailhead that holds the South's two halves together, end quote. President Abraham Lincoln perceived, quote, Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket, end quote. Hence, it was essential to find a route in order to maneuver into Vicksburg, especially after the Confederacy lost Columbus, Kentucky, as well as Island Number 10. Vicksburg is the last Confederate stronghold on the mighty Mississippi. An attempt is made May 18th, 1862, to secure a 2-mile stretch along the Vicksburg batteries. Then the rank of flag officer, David Farragut, travels up the river, at which time that Commander Samuel P. Lee aboard the USS Oneida delivered an order for the surrender of the city. 5 hours later, he receives a very defiant and succinct reply from Brigadier General Martin Luther Smith. No. That's all he says. No. And he's the commander at that point. This is followed up, absolutely followed up with Commander Colonel James Autry saying very simply, Mississippians don't know and refuse to learn how to surrender to an enemy, end quote. As a result of this, Farragut is going to withdraw. He is going to make a second attempt on July 1st with Flag Officer Charles H. Davis. His flotilla of gunboats carrying Brigadier General Thomas Williams, 32,000 forces. And while bombing the city, Williams' troops attempted to dig a canal across the peninsula. This is going to be very, very important. Sorry, somebody has, I don't mean to be rude, but somebody has their microphone. Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm just getting a lot of feedback. I apologize. I just was getting a lot of feedback. Okay, so Thomas Williams, 32,000 troops, and they are bombing the city. And I'm going back to it because this is pretty significant. Williams' men try to build a canal to allow boats to bypass the Confederate boundaries, the batteries. This is really important because the foundations of this canal, they give up. They can't do it. The flood waters come in, waters come rushing in, and the canal failed. The water levels, are up and down, and they decide to give that up. In addition to this chaotic situation that is happening with Williams, as well as the Navy, we are going to see, is this moving? The arrival of the CSS Arkansas. This ironclad comes slowly steaming in the Mississippi. And once they see this, Farragut, along with Williams, just begin, and they withdraw, while Davis returns to Memphis. As the Union became more concerned with Chattanooga and the efforts in Kentucky, attention drifted away from Vicksburg. And so this is how Vicksburg looked in 1863. This presents a great opportunity for the people of Vicksburg and the commanders at Vicksburg. With us not paying attention to the city, all of a sudden they can work on their fortifications, they can prepare their defenses, because it is clear very clear that an attempt is going to be made to seize the city. The Pennsylvania-born Lieutenant General John Pemberton was selected to command the Confederacy's new Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana. It incorporated both Port Hudson as well as, and Vicksburg. This is part of General Joseph Eggleston Johnston's Department of the West. Now, this becomes a little confusing and problematic because Pemberton is concerned with the defense of his department and concentrating on maintaining both Vicksburg and Port Hudson, and he continues to reinforce Vicksburg and stockpiling supplies. But what becomes confusing is that he's going to be confronted with some obstacles in his command. He is supposed to report directly to the Confederate War Department, not to Joseph E. Johnston. And so therefore, he doesn't have authority over the troops stationed on the far bank of the Mississippi. They are under a completely different department. And so when there are seams where two departments meet, that is the most vulnerable area. The lines of communication between the two commanders, the lines of communication between the two departments. This is what they call a seam. And this seam is very, very weak. Grant's Army of the Tennessee prepared to make an attempt to capture Vicksburg. Planning the strategy to take Vicksburg created a lot of problems because in many ways it was impenetrable. If circumstances were ideal, so we always have to throw that in there. If circumstances are ideal, it would have been logical to move forces down the Mississippi River and then land the forces just on the outskirts of the city, keeping the supplies on the river transports and then advance from the northeast to Vicksburg. The problem, however, and again, as we look at our geographic positioning of Vicksburg, is the Yazoo River Delta to the north. This pretty much made that option completely impossible. This area, this delta, extends for 140 miles. At points, it is 40 miles wide. And in there also, is that the problem is that there is going to be Chickasaw Bluffs. So Chickasaw Bluff was ideal for defenders. It really could only be used as a last resort. The land to the south of the city was guarded over by artillery, which would make troop movement almost impossible. Slide was out of order. The Mississippi River is half a mile wide at this point at Vicksburg. So that's going to be a major obstacle. In addition, the Mississippi Central Railroad was notoriously unreliable. Options are limited because if they were to use transports, soldiers would have to march 250 miles to find the most ideal location upon which they can begin moving in towards Vicksburg. Grant decides upon an overland route. He readies his Army of the Tennessee for his advance. His principal subordinates, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, Major General John McClernand. McClernand, by the way, is a political general. And then Brigadier General James Birdseye McPherson. McPherson and Sherman are both West Pointers. McClernand is a complete, total political general. In addition, the naval arm is going to be essential here. Rear Admiral Donald Dixon Porter, who had assumed command of the Mississippi River Squadron in October of 1862. And he commanded 58 vessels, combat vessels, which included 13 ironclads, 34 commercial vessels with light armor, as well as other ships. Farragut's Western Gulf Blocking Squadron will maintain a presence below Fort Hudson, which is about 200 miles to the south. It's basically across from Baton Rouge. There were naval ships that are also going to be incorporated that will carry combat troops. This would provide Grant with supplies and crushing firepower. Grant and Porter really had a collaborative effort, even though neither one held authority over the other. They couldn't order each other. They couldn't direct each other. But both men knew what was reasonable to request of the other. Ultimately, the planning of the campaign remained in Grant's hands. But Porter will have authority over river-related operations. It is on November 26, 1862, that Grant begins a two-pronged advance with 45,000 troops from Western Tennessee into northwestern Mississippi. The main body will advance to Grand Junction from Tennessee and march along the Mississippi Central Railroad line. Grant had established a railhead at Holly Springs, Mississippi, in order to keep his troops supplied, while he ordered the men to secure provisions from the countryside. As things commenced, it looked like things were going well. There is this false sense of optimism taking place. Meanwhile, Pemberton orders his 30,000 men to prepare a defensive position along the Tallahatchie River. On December 2nd, when Union troops got to the Tallahatchie, they found that Pemberton's men had fallen back to the Yallabusha River about 50 miles away. Brigadier General Alvin P. Hovey had a force of 7,000 from the Department of the Missouri. He crossed into Helena, Arkansas, and raided behind Pemberton's line. In the wake of all of these events that just transpired, Grant directs Sherman to take one division back to Memphis in order to gather more troops, then attack Vicksburg via river while Grant was advancing on the Yallabusha. Grant was never able to actually mount an attack on the Yallabusha River at this time. Things start to fall apart even more on December 20th, when Confederate Major General Earl Van Dorn, he's a really interesting character, by the way, attacks Grant's supply base at Holly Springs. Meanwhile, Nathan Bedford Forrest is leading raids and destroying the railroads. So now these railroads that were at the Union rear, with the foodstuffs destroyed, with the railroads destroyed, Grant has to withdraw to Tennessee instead of launching his attack. He instructs his men to live off the land. And this part of Mississippi fed Grant's soldiers very well. This is an important and lasting lesson for the Union Army. It should be noted, just by the way, that the raid on Holly Springs was the only instance in the Civil War where cavalry action determined the outcome of a campaign. In addition, it is the very last time that we are going to see the Confederates take the initiative, and on a large scale. From this point forward, to secure a path to Vicksburg, there would be a pattern that will be repeated over and over and over again. Grant would act, Pemberton would respond to his actions. Meanwhile, Sherman is sent to, I was trying to see if that, sorry about that. Sherman is sent to Chickasaw Bluffs. But the Confederates had not been idle while all of these other events were taking place. the commander of Vicksburg, Martin Luther Smith, who we met before, ordered Brigadier General Stephen Dill Lee to march 5,500 of his soldiers to defend the Chickasaw Bayou. And so you can see the Chickasaw Bayou here on the map on both the left and then on the right. With the withdrawal of Grant, Pemberton is able to get reinforcements into Vicksburg via the rail line, which increase their defenses at the bayou to 15,000. Pemberton himself is going to be able to arrive. He actually arrives on December 26th while the battle is underway, which is what is the first major engagement of the Vicksburg campaign. Sherman's 32,000 men advance downriver from Mississippi to the Yazoo to threaten Walnut Hills, which is also known as Chickasaw Bluffs. If you go back to Clausewitz, it's 2-to-1 odds. Sherman has 32,000 men. The Confederacy has 15,000. This should have been technically easy for them to secure this area. The challenge is Chickasaw Bluffs. The plan was to overwhelm the Confederate line, break their line, open the road to Vicksburg. He knew that more troops were coming to reinforce the Confederates, and that the attack would have to happen before additional manpower could arrive, and his advantage was lost. They held their position in the swamps, in the bayous, below the bluffs, most notably the Chickasaw Bayou. Confederate Major Generals Carter Stevens, Martin Smith, Brigadier General Stephen Smith, they take their 15,000 troops to defend the bluffs. So the Confederates have the high ground here. They are aided by the clear view of any attackers. They're looking down on Sherman and his men, and they have heavy artillery, which is just going to rain down on the Union soldiers. December 26th through 29th is really the focal point of the battle. The Union troops are basically shot down as they are trying to advance uphill. Sherman is also completely unaware that Grant is not going to be able to reinforce him, as the Confederates had cut the telegraph lines, so he has no way of knowing what's going to happen. Just to put this in perspective, there are 1,776 total casualties for the Union. Sherman halts the attack as a result of this and will march 12 miles north of Vicksburg. The Confederacy lost 207, and I don't mean to belittle it, that is 207 individuals. But this is a huge difference. And Sherman concedes defeat, asks for a truce in order to bury the fallen Union soldiers. Federal burial parties reported that some of the bodies had been stripped of their clothing, as well as their weapons and their ammunition. They appeared as though also they said that these men had been shot in the back of the head after sustaining non-lethal wounds. So just kind of keep that in perspective. People in the North are utterly horrified by this battle. They outraged by a completely futile loss. They likened it to what happened at Fredericksburg. Sherman and Grant, again, endure very heavy criticism. They, no progress had been made in the taking of Vicksburg. This was a reckless assault. And it seemed at this point in time that the Union was going to be stagnant. In what is known, in terms of Civil War, they refer to 1863 as, inconclusive year. This is the start of that inconclusive year. Grant's armies are geographically closer to Vicksburg, but still not able to maneuver into the city. There is also another matter at hand that John McClernand is issuing orders in defiance of what Grant was ordering. And this is going to lead to a huge controversy. And McClernand is reaching out to DC, trying to, get himself to take over Grant's command. Grant issues General Orders number 13. It states that Grant himself would take direct command of the Army of the Mississippi, as well as the Army of the Tennessee. Lincoln actually liked that. He was kind of happy to see McClernand put in his place. And ultimately, Lincoln likes Grant because he fights. Now, Grant had considered moving his forces back to Memphis in order to wait for the spring to go down the Mississippi River and attempt to capture Vicksburg. But when he reflected on this, if he went back to Memphis, this is just failure. He's just conceding that they had failed, construed as a defeat. And at this point, the United States cannot endure another defeat. In later reflection in his memoirs, Grant wrote, quote, "At the time, the North had become very much discouraged. Many strong men in the Union Army believed that the war must prove a failure. The elections of 1862 had gone against the party, which was for the prosecution of the war to save the Union, if it took the last man and last dollar. It was my judgment at the time that to make a backward movement as long as that from Vicksburg to Memphis would be interpreted by many of those yet full of hope for the preservation of the Union as a defeat, and that the draft would be resisted, desertions ensue, and the power to capture and punish deserters lost. There is nothing left to be done but to go forward to a decisive victory. This, in my mind, from the moment I took command in person at Young's Point," end quote. They gotta go. They have to move. There is no other option at this point in time. Grant holds, he will position his forces north of the city. He diligently works on a way to secure as he quote says, quote, "secure a foothold on dry ground on the east side of the river." What will take place were a series of 4 different expeditions. These expeditions include Grant's Canal, Lake Providence, Yazoo Pass, as well as the Steel Bayou expedition. As a matter of time, I'm not going to go through all of the details, but just to make you familiar. The first attempt was to dig Grant's Canal. They are going to base it on that ditch that I referred to that was started to be dug in 1862. This is located at Young's Point. Grant really had his doubts about the ability of a canal to alter the flow of the Mississippi River to the south of the city. With word from Major General Henry Halleck that the president favored this option, Grant just had to proceed. There's no other option. While attempts were made to bring steamers down the Mississippi, downriver towards, from Vicksburg to land on the eastern shore while bypassing the Vicksburg batteries, Sherman and the 15th Corps reach Young's Point. They are tasked with turning what they called the plantation ditch into a 6 by 6.5 foot deep, 60-foot wide, and 1.5 mile long canal. Captain Frederick Prime, the lead engineer, determined that the current ditch opening was not sufficient enough to use. So basically, they have to start from scratch. It is cold rain, they are in mud, and so as they go to a new entry point, the men become ill, the river becomes so engorged, and after about a month of work, they're working for a month of completely fruitless labor, the soldiers were given a new sort of technology, a steam pump that helped to draw the water out. They are also aided by the fact that the waters are starting to recede. The problem is incessant rains start again, and the work draws to a halt. Once they're operational again, and the dredges arrive to expedite the program, Grant reports to the War Department, you never say these things until they're done, quote, "The canal is near completion," end quote. In actuality, it wasn't. They weren't even close. Water floods the soldiers' encampments. Their focus shifts to quell the waters. And this gives the Confederacy more ample time to relocate their guns, to position them across from the canal, which basically meant any Union ship penetrating the region could easily be destroyed. Operation on Grant's Canal ceases on February 23rd. Meanwhile, the Lake Providence expedition was being worked on concurrently in order to find a route from the Red River near Port Hudson, 240 miles way, to the Mississippi. If this route could be opened, Nathaniel Banks, who was advancing on Port Hudson. McPherson is assigned with this task, and McPherson makes a determination that Ashton, Arkansas levee could be breached, okay? And the area behind the river was about 8 feet higher. This would enable the land to be flooded, which would be significant in the way that the river flowed, which would be ultimately, alter both the Mississippi and the Red River. With this, March 3rd, the levee is breached. The short-lived optimism, once again, would be quickly tempered with the discovery of a cypress swamp. Thus, the second expedition will be abandoned. Third attempt was the one that Grant really put his hopes on, and that is the Yazoo Pass expedition. There is located for the river on the Mississippi, where the river goes through Lake Moon before heading east to Coldwater River, ultimately connecting. There's a whole variety of different ways that it goes, ultimately connecting with the Mississippi north of Vicksburg. Coordinating with the Navy, once again, helped to make the initial attempt here appear that it was going to be successful. So for the third time, they think they are successful. However, the discovery of, I thought I had a picture of Fort Pemberton, and as well as the naval assault that transpired, combined with a whole nother series of unfortunate events. As a result, on April 4th, the Union forces start to make their withdrawal, and then we will see on April 5th, 1865, the official end of the Yazoo Pass expedition. That's just going to lead one more option, Steele's Bayou. This is the confrontation at Fort Pemberton encounter led the Union troops to discover that Confederate forces were reinforcing Greenwood, which could actually make both their communication and supply lines completely vulnerable. In order to use this route, Grant's men, the Union troops, would have to traverse the Yazoo River west of Vicksburg and advance to the mouth of Steele's Bayou, then to Black Bayou, onto Deer Creek, then maneuver 32 miles to Rolling Fork Creek, go then 4 miles east into the Big Sunflower River, and ultimately moving back to the Yazoo River just below Fort Pemberton, north of Vicksburg. During the course of this particular attempt, Confederate troops attempted to block the Union advance. Once again, there were a complex series of events that unfurled ultimately, leading Grant to call off the fourth and final expedition. This is 4 failures in trying to take Vicksburg by April of 1863. Grant is in dire need to come up with a solution. With the complexity of these failures, of the advances on the city, Grant had to effectively evaluate and assess the situation and determine what was the best option. However, he felt he finally figured out a way in how he could successfully take the city. In order to accomplish this, he would march the army through the swamps down the west bank of the Mississippi River, cross south, and get behind Vicksburg, thus applying the concepts of shared leadership. This operation is going to be done in coordination with the Navy in the leadership of Donald Dixon Porter, who amassed his ships and set out under the cover of darkness on April 16th, 1863. They set out at about 21:15. Porter orders all of his ironclads to divert their exhaust steam into the paddle wheel housing to muffle the steam engine so the ships can't be heard. His flotilla makes what they call the midnight run. And again, they are going to be discovered eventually by the Vicksburg batteries. The discovery comes about 23:16, and they lit up the sky. Sailors said it gave the illusion that Vicksburg was completely on fire. One ship, the Benton, is seriously harmed, but amazingly, Porter and his flotilla will make their way past the batteries and await the next phase. Grant's strategy had worked. On the night of April 22nd, 6 more transports loaded with supplies made another run and sustained minimal damage. Then on April 30th, the largest amphibious operation ever conducted by an American force prior to World War II, Porter's fleet transports 22,000 men across the Mississippi. Thus, under the cover of darkness, Grant will ferry his army across the river using barges and shallow draft steamers through the bayous, winding past Vicksburg on the Louisiana side. And on April 30th, Grant's army, his soldiers begin crossing the Mississippi at Bruinsburg. This is just to put it in perspective, as you can see on the map, 50 miles south of Vicksburg. At this point, Grant decides they needed to march to the capital. They have to march to Jackson. This is 40 miles to the east. There are 4 major rail lines in Jackson. His army is going to be completely exposed in this maneuver. They are going to live off the land, and the goal is to get to Jackson, accomplish this, and cut off all supplies that could come into Vicksburg, Mississippi. General Joseph Eggleston Johnston arrives at Jackson. Upon meeting with the commander, Brigadier General John Gregg, Johnston assesses the situation and grimly stated, quote, "I am too late." He orders an evacuation of the city. Meanwhile, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, Major General James Birdseye McPherson conduct their advance, and thus the Battle of Jackson will commence after torrential rains, and it starts May 14th in the rain, which is going to make it even more difficult. Albeit completely chaotic, the Union victory here at Jackson would ensure that the Jackson war industries were destroyed, that the supplies that were there would never reach the Confederate troops, not only the troops that withdrew from Jackson, but troops in Vicksburg, as well as civilians. Thus, the armies will then swing towards Vicksburg. Grant, with this having been handled, and so again, you can see where Johnston has gone to, you can see Pemberton, and then, of course, the movement of the Union forces. Grant can focus solely on Pemberton. He is armed with the knowledge that he acquired from a spy. Grant knows that Johnston told Pemberton to withdraw from Vicksburg and march east to unite with him. With this information in hand, Grant had to act expeditiously in order to prevent this link from happening. While the Union troops are advancing, they are acting in concert, the communications were great, the Confederates ended up being spread all out in a series of very costly battles for both the Union and the Confederacy. Pemberton called his disheartened remaining troops to retreat back into Vicksburg. Pemberton had watched these troops fail time and time again. He had watched Grant fail in all of the bayous time and time again. But now Grant is on the banks of the Mississippi River with a formidable force. Pemberton shared his very emotional thoughts with a staff officer. He said, quote, "Just 30 years ago, I began my military career by receiving my appointment as a cadet at the United States Military Academy. Today, on the very same date, that career has ended in disaster and disgrace," end quote. An observation on the return of the Confederate forces back into Vicksburg accounted for their ultimate disdain of the leadership. Quote, "Many of the troops declared their willingness to desert rather than serve under Pemberton again," end quote. The reality, the worst was yet to come. Though it appeared as though the Confederate forces at Vicksburg had been destroyed, ultimately, they were not. They received reinforcements. We are going to see that they are going to receive 2 fresh divisions under the commands of Major General John Horace Forney, as well as Martin Luther Smith. They not only provided troops, but they provided weapons. And so they have 9 major fortifications secured by 102 pieces of artillery. All of the entrances to the city are well guarded. So the defenses of Vicksburg actually are handled pretty well done. Okay? And I'm seeing a couple questions. I'll, if you don't mind, I'll go back and answer them when we get through. Okay. Now, what was to come next for Vicksburg really was unexpected. On May 18th, oh, sorry. Okay. Why isn't my advancing? Okay. On May 18th, Grant and Sherman rode out to Chickasaw Bluffs, where Sherman had failed in the previous fall. With their forces in place, we are going to see Grant order a hasty assault on May 19th, 1863. One that is halted by the Confederate forces at great cost. Sherman's corps lost 134 killed, 571 wounded, and 8 were missing in action. McPherson and McClernand, whose corps were still largely moving into position, suffered 23 killed and 206 wounded. This is a mess. It's an absolute mess. In an attempt to avoid a prolonged siege, Grant attempted a second attack on May 22nd of 1863. This was a coordinated assault that involved all 3 corps. The Union soldiers rose from their trenches. And that previous picture, you could see the remnants of the trenches actually on Vicksburg, and charged the Confederate earthworks. A Confederate soldier described the scene saying, quote, "Suddenly the roar of guns ceased. I sprang to my feet and looked in the direction of the enemy. When they seemed to be springing from the bowels of the earth, a long line in each direction. It was a grand and an appalling sight," ends quote. As Grant's men, and here you can just kind of see some of the earthworks, as Grant's men advanced, they were met with artillery barrages and infantry springing out of their trenches on the outskirts. This is another reckless and bloody assault, an instance where Grant attempted to apply the command strategy of taking a calculated risk based on identifying opportunities, absolutely failed. This assault led the ground littered with dead and wounded. Now, it's a commonality for the losing general, the losing officer, the one that's the greatest casualties, to request a truce, but temporary, so that they can remove the bodies. To Grant, a temporary truce meant failure. 3 days, 3 days, these men's bodies are strewn across these fields, and many of them were still alive. They are screaming in pain. And so I'll go back to here. It's not in the stench. I mean, imagine it. It is the hot Mississippi sun, and the stench becomes unbearable. The bodies are bloated, animals are coming in everywhere. And finally, it's going to be Pemberton that requests a truce on May 25th so that they can remove the bodies. Of note, Grant later stated that he regretted this just as much as he regretted Cold Harbor. Having experienced all these failures, Grant decides that the only option left is to commence a siege on the city. This is not going to be the first time a city was sieged during the Civil War, because technically Fort Sumter is considered to be the first siege. but it is going to be the very first time that the Union Army is going to siege a civilian population. Grant simply concluded, quote, "We'll have to dig our way in." And that is exactly what the Union troops are going to do. They are going to dig their first line into fighting position. So basically, we're still looking at Vauban's system of siege. It's very modified, but the division, the movement of parallel lines. They are doing this, the first parallel to the Confederate works. They're doing it so that they can protect themselves and from, basically, any type of attack. During the course of the day, the Union soldiers basically shot at anything that moved, anything. Artillery is also essential to the siege operations. And so what we are going to see is that they are going to just begin moving their cannon. They are going to fortify every position. Combined with Rear Admiral Porter's gunboats that were lobbing off 220-pound shells. The shells fell both day and night upon Vicksburg. Pemberton tells his cannon his artillery that they can't use their cannon. They have to save it for when the Union troops actually advance into the city. Hope for any type of reinforcements is gone. There is no way, because Sherman is going to keep Johnston engaged, and they are going to play a constant game of cat and mouse. It's too late. The 47 days of this siege, Grant's forces swell to 77,000 in number. There are 12 miles of earthworks that wrap around the enemy lines. These vast numbers, Grant is able to rotate his troops so that they could periodically get off the line and get out of the heat. Pemberton does not have that luxury. In the wake of the constant bombardment, citizens as well as soldiers are going to endure misery. The heat was oppressive. When the thunderstorms erupted, they filled the ditches with water. Soon food is going to be scarce. The continued strife led to soldiers as well as civilians take refuge in caves. Of note, these caves have long remained one of the most unique aspects of Vicksburg. Some of these caves had 1 or 2 rooms. Some housed up to 200 people. Often the caves had multiple entrances, 1 because of airflow, and 2 simply if there was a collapse. The interesting point, they try to live their life as normal in caves. They have carpets, they have furniture, they have books, candles, flowers, whatever the case may be. So here you can see the amenities, in the caves. African Americans were digging the caves, $30 to $50 a cave. And so this is life in Vicksburg. What we are also going to see is that food is going to become very, very scarce. Pemberton's men are reduced to eating all of the mules. They will hold rat hunts in the trenches. Citizens are eating cats, dogs, rats, mice, birds. It was said there was not an animal left alive in Vicksburg. While this is happening to the soldiers and civilians, Union soldiers had an overabundance of food. They're basically throwing stuff out. The Confederates sent a warning to the Yankees, look out. We have a new general, General Starvation. The Confederate soldier spirits truly start to break. Pemberton actually receives an anonymous note on June 28th, 1863, which read, quote, "If you can't feed us, you had better surrender us. Horrible as the idea is, then suffer this noble army to disgrace themselves by desertion. It is signed, many soldiers," end quote. The citizens, the soldiers, everyone is suffering. In the wake of all this, people are getting diarrhea, they are getting dysentery, they are getting malaria. There is no antibiotics yet. We don't have them. We don't have Imodium. We don't have any of the things that we have today. Coffin makers are unable to keep up with the demand. The fear and anxiety of what is going to happen to the people that resided in Vicksburg was all encompassing on so many different levels. I mean, it's really hard for us to figure out what they were experiencing, what they were feeling. One such woman, Kate Stone, kept a really good diary about Vicksburg. It has been published. She's scared of the USCT. She is afraid what's going to happen to her, a Southern woman of virtue, when African-American troops come and invade the city. Others live in fear of that if they're going to be tortured, if they're going to be raped, what's going to happen to them? By July 3rd, 1863, Grant's men are within 100 yards of the Confederate lines. We're talking a football field here. The people who resided in Vicksburg and those defending the city were just suffering too greatly, realizing that he has no other options. Pemberton will arrange for a ceasefire. He will send Brigadier General John S. Bowen and Colonel L.M. Montgomery with the white flag of truce, of surrender. By the way, Bowen's going to die shortly after this. He is so sick as well. As traditional practice, the men are blindfolded and they are taken to offer their surrender in offices. Grant wanted unconditional surrender, but he is going to, when he meets with Pemberton, offer the Confederate soldiers a parole. They would be exchanged for Union prisoners of war. The agreement was that these men would never take up arms again. Let's be real. Most of these Confederate soldiers are going to be in the field of battle soon after. Pemberton accepted the terms officially at midnight on July 4th, 1863. The choice of the dates made Southerners wonder about this Northern-born Pemberton. They thought he did it intentionally. And that leads to why nobody celebrates on July 4th. As the Confederate troops march by, the Union soldiers are empathetic. They offer water. They offer food. They offer their condolences. Approximately 29,500 surrendered. As stated by Abraham Lincoln, quote, "The father of the waters again goes unvexed to the sea," end quote. The surrender of Vicksburg took an entire Confederate field army out of the war. Basically, 30,000 soldiers signed parole papers at Vicksburg. Yeah, like I said, they returned to war, others deserted. In addition to this force, the Confederacy lost 60,000 small arms, as well as 260 cannon here. Strategically, the loss of Vicksburg divides the Confederacy in two. And from this point forward, that the military operations of east of the Mississippi and west of the Mississippi would be conducted separately. Lincoln wrote Grant July 13th, 1862, about the Vicksburg campaign. He started with, quote, "I do not remember that you and I ever met personally. I write this now as a grateful acknowledgement for the almost inestimable service you have done for this country." He goes on to detail what happened. Lincoln was good like that. He talked about the failures that Grant had. That was kind of his nature. He concludes the letter by saying, quote, "I now wish to make personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong." The first days of the month of July in 1863 effectively changed the strategy and the course of the Civil War. The struggle for Vicksburg had lasted for more than a year, and when it was over, the outcome of the Civil War appeared more certain. So thank you. I don't know if people have been to Vicksburg. I just show you the cemetery. I really highly recommend it. It is absolutely amazing, just to show you some of the monuments and, of course, the famous statue in here. So thank you very much. So I'm going to stop my share. And then, take a look. I'm going to look quickly at the chat to see. I saw that there were a couple questions. I'm sorry. First, yeah, I saw somebody ask about, there was a Confederate mission that took place to try to capture Grant in Mississippi. Clearly, it was not successful. But this was ordered by the Confederacy. They wanted to see if they could, if they could capture Grant, then they could negotiate some type of settlement with that. The question about New Orleans being the largest city in the South comes to the point, and I probably should have been a little bit more specific. The largest defended, and I'm sorry, I did leave that out. Richmond was the largest defended city, and then Vicksburg was the second largest defended city. I'm sorry, I realized after I said that, that it was, in dealing with defense. And correct, Vicksburg is the second largest. We'll see here and there. Movie Legend of Van Dorn. Oh, that should be interesting. What we see is, why didn't Pemberton retreat from Vicksburg? So Pemberton is unable to retreat because with the arrival of Grant's forces with the Army of the Tennessee moving in, their evacuation route is ultimately blocked. And as the men get engaged in so much conflict, these men are weakened. They are really kind of destroyed. And so they're unable. The cavalry raid, honestly, I had to keep my time short. So I really couldn't go into absolutely every detail in such. And again, I see the comments about all the cities, the largest defended city. And again, that was a misspeaking on my part. The Arkansas Post, even though it is a little bit of the Trans-Mississippi, it is incorporated into the Vicksburg campaign. Absolutely. Thank you. Guessing this could never happen today. That's really interesting. It's a great question, Adam. Grant orders his troops to live off the land. Modern. I don't think that with the way that media is today, with the way of the observation and all the judgments made of our troop actions, of soldiers' activities, because we can view it, because we are seeing this. I doubt highly it could be done today, but it's not completely impossible. Grant's decisions, absolutely, our modern military can use this. And I think this stuff can potentially come into play. We are plain and simple, the war, as we talk about all the conflicts taking place. What's happening in the Ukraine is a diversion from what is happening for example, in Nigeria, what is happening in regards to what's taking place with Taiwan, what is happening in the Sudan, what is happening in the Middle East. And so all of these actions happening, Grant's decisions here, there were a lot of distractions, a lot of diversions from the actual campaigning. And if you really look at the strategy, was it difficult? Was there failure after failure after failure? Absolutely. We experience that today. But ultimately, when you let the commanding officer use his knowledge, make great command decisions, and basically gets left alone from Washington, D.C., he does calculated risks. They come at huge costs, but we absolutely can continue to do this, learn from this today. Vicksburg's got a lot of monuments. Thank you. Just trying to see if anybody has any other questions. Yeah, I do put a lot of work. Thank you. I appreciate that. That question about the Vicksburg reunions, it didn't become a priority. There is just such hostility and animosity at Vicksburg. And I'm sure it deals so much with the fact of what happened to the civilian population. And so we didn't see the same type, large scale. Were there some little reunions that happened? Yes, but it was all completely small scale. Does anybody else have any other questions? I know I went a little bit longer than I was supposed to.
No, we don't have any time constraint. As long as it's a great program, we could have gone all night and we would have stayed with you on this thing. Just a question I wanted to ask. In Battlefield, Hallowed Ground, the magazine for Battlefield Trust, they show a good portion of the Vicksburg battlefield that apparently was eroded away or washed away.
Yes. Yeah. That actually, and it happened very recently. And I'm gonna get my year incorrectly. Like the pictures that I was showing you of the cemetery, like there is great destruction. And so it came with when the Mississippi, with the different storms that happened, there is a lot that was destroyed again. My pictures are from, before that this happened. But yeah, there was a lot of destruction at Vicksburg. And, the hope is that they can get things restructured and rebuilt. But so much is lost when, nature comes into play.
The other thing is, what about the river itself? They said, I've never been there, but it said apparently it moved and it's no longer in the same place it was.
Yeah, actually, first of all, there was, and again, I'll get the year wrong on this. They actually, the engineers had to reroute the river to an extent. I'm gonna say it was done. I could be completely wrong. I know it is done at least again in around 1868, 1878, that they are going to kind of change the flow of the river. And so when you look at it today, it is slightly different than that picture that I showed you of Vicksburg, in 1863. And it was done in hopes of preventing such heavy floods. Clearly, that did not work.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? Okay, I want to thank you. That's another great presentation, and I'm looking forward to next year for next year's presentation. Before we go, I should have mentioned earlier, and this is totally changing the subject. Our program has been offered as a public service to the various libraries who will take us. We've offered it. Some people think of it. In any event, Parsippany Library was the first one. And what people do is you sign up with the library. You don't sign up with us. So there are people on here whose names I don't recognize because they're coming directly from the library. And we have 11 libraries throughout the state. And probably by next month, I'll have another library in Massachusetts. Again, the library has a choice of listing our link, or they have a choice of using their link. In other words, you sign up with the library, you don't sign up with them. So some of the libraries, I should mention them because they're really good, is I mentioned Parsippany, that was the first one. The Roxbury Library, the Rockaway Library, the Kemmerer Library, that's in Harding Township, Hackettstown Library, Chester Library, Morristown Library, and then we're carried a few other put up our notices on their bulletin board. So we never know how many people are coming in because they're coming in from the other sources. What we've done is, in order to avoid the problem, we increase our Zoom participation. Unfortunately, I thought we'd do better tonight, but we increase our Zoom participation to 500 to cover an excess of this. So if you're listening out there, I don't care where you are, Abigail sends out we send out the program. Abigail sends out the link, and the library puts it on. And what happens is, what I learned from the libraries, they get credit for all the people attending our meeting as part of the people coming into the library. So it's a win-win situation for the libraries. And again, we're not going to ask them for anything. That's our public service, like you say, at the end of a PBS program. Next month is the Civil War legal presentation, and we will be discovering General Grant, President Grant, after the war. Again, I thank you all for coming. 2 weeks is Election Day, and that's the other important part of what's happening in 2 weeks from now. Is anybody else want to add anything? All right, then we'll say good night then. Heidi, again, thank you. Really, thank you.
Thank
What a
you.
great job.
Thank you for having me again. It's always an honor and a privilege.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.